The snow had begun falling sometime before dawn, covering the winding Vermont backroads with a soft white silence. By the time Elena Hart left her cabin at 6:45 a.m., the flakes had already piled into gentle drifts across her driveway. She wore her favorite green scarf, the one her sister Rachel had knitted years ago, and a wool coat that brushed her knees. Her hands were gloved, but trembling as she locked the front door. She did not know this morning would be the last time anyone would see her alive. The air was sharp with cold and quiet. The engine of her old Subaru rattled to life, headlights flickering weakly against the white curtain of snow. She reversed slowly, carefully maneuvering down the hill, unaware that the tire tracks she left behind would soon vanish beneath a fresh layer of snowfall. No neighbors saw her go. No passing drivers noticed her car on the road. Elena was simply there, and then she was not. 2 hours later, her principal would report her absence to the school office. They would assume she was delayed. By lunch, someone would suggest maybe she stayed home because of the weather. But by 3 p.m., when the last bell rang and students bundled themselves into buses and waiting cars, concern began to settle like frost in the corners of every conversation. A call to her phone rang endlessly. A visit to her house revealed the driveway undisturbed, except for the faded morning tracks. The snow continued falling. Her mailbox remained unopened. Elena had been a dependable teacher, the kind who arrived early and stayed late. This absence wasn't just unusual, it was impossible to explain. At 6:00 p.m., the police arrived at her house responding to the growing anxiety of friends and co-workers. Officer Barnes was first on the scene, noting the cold coffee mug still sitting on the kitchen table, half drunk, and a textbook open to a chapter about post-war civil rights movements. The heat was still running. Nothing looked disturbed. But her purse was gone and so were her keys. Her phone remained on the kitchen counter screen dark. The Subaru was missing. It looked as if she had left for work and never returned. Her father, who lived 2 towns over, was notified. Rachel Hart, living in Boston at the time, received the call late that evening. Her voice cracked when she said she would be on the next train. The snowfall continued through the night. By morning, a search had begun. Local volunteers and officers combed the wooded areas along Route 18, the road Elena would have taken to school. Her students gathered in the gymnasium in silence, trying to understand why their teacher hadn't come back. Flyers went up at the gas station, the post office, and the corner bakery. Elena's face smiled out from every bulletin board in town. She was 31 years old, loved by her students, passionate about history and literature, and known for her gentleness. People remembered how she stayed late to help struggling kids or brought in extra snacks for students who came to school hungry. No one could imagine why someone would hurt her. 3 days later, her car was discovered near a frozen lake 5 miles outside of town. The doors were locked. Her bag sat on the passenger seat, zipped shut. A student folder lay beside it with scribbled homework pages inside. No footprints surrounded the vehicle, no signs of a struggle. The keys were missing. Investigators broke the driver's side window to gain entry. The heater switch had been set to high, but the engine was cold. It was as if Elena had simply vanished into the falling snow, her car left behind like an unfinished sentence. Local news picked up the story. The phrase "missing schoolteacher" appeared across morning headlines. A week passed, then 2. Rumors began to fill the silence. One rumor pointed to a student named Liam Brooks, a quiet boy who had been in Elena's class for 2 years. He had once been suspended for bringing a knife to school. Another time he had carved her name into his desk. Teachers had whispered concerns about his obsession with her, but no formal complaint was ever made. He was interviewed by police, but no charges were filed. He claimed he hadn't seen her that day. Still, his name lingered in conversations like smoke. Rachel arrived in town during the 2nd week of the investigation. Her face was pale, tired, clenched with disbelief. She walked the snowy trails near the lake where Elena's car had been found. She visited the school, sat in her sister's empty classroom, and stared at the stacks of ungraded papers and coffee-ringed lesson plans. Rachel moved back into the old family home, a creaking structure on Maple Hollow Road that smelled of cedar and old books. Their father had slipped deeper into confusion in recent years, and Rachel now found herself balancing grief with caretaking. She pored over police reports and interviewed old friends. She requested Elena's emails and journal entries. She read them all, searching for a clue, a confession, anything. But all she found were lesson plans, grocery lists, and quiet reflections about her students. There was no hint of fear or danger. Nothing pointed to a life in peril. Rachel felt adrift, a sister in mourning, without a body to bury or a cause to fight. Winter passed into spring and the lake thawed, but divers found nothing. There were no new leads. The case remained open but cold. Rachel returned to Boston, eventually forced back to her job and the life she had put on hold. Yet the weight of Elena's absence never left her. Every year, on February 17th, the day Elena disappeared, she lit a candle in her apartment window and left it burning through the night. Sometimes she would receive a call from someone who thought they had seen her. Once, a woman in Portland claimed Elena was teaching art under a new name. Another time, someone said they saw her at a bus terminal in Des Moines. All leads were dead ends. Rachel followed them all anyway. 18 years passed. Elena Hart's name faded from the headlines and bulletin boards. The school retired her parking spot and gave a scholarship in her name to aspiring teachers. Her students grew up, graduated, and moved on. The snow kept falling year after year over the frozen lake and forgotten trails. Rachel never stopped waiting. But it would not be the police or her own search that would uncover what truly happened to her sister. It would come from the most unlikely place: a middle school writing contest. A shy girl with a curious essay and a story that began like a ghost tale whispered among children. One sentence would light the spark. The woman in the walls. The essay arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked into a folder stamped with the school's seal. It had been submitted as part of the annual statewide middle school writing contest and was one among hundreds collected by the district office. A volunteer named Sandra, a retired English teacher, was the first to read it. She sat in a quiet office at the back of the administration building, sipping lukewarm coffee as she scanned the pages. The title was simple but strange: The Woman in the Walls. The handwriting was neat and measured. The story at first read like a ghost tale. A girl describing an old school building where whispers traveled through vents and footsteps echoed behind plaster. But then the details shifted. The narrator spoke of a real teacher who had vanished. The description matched Elena Hart in more ways than coincidence allowed. The girl described an unused boiler room, a bricked wall, a game her older brother once played. Sandra's coffee cooled as she read the final line. They said it was a game, but I think someone never came back out. Sandra placed the pages down and stared at the wall in front of her. The essay was fictional in theory, but it read like a confession. The voice was that of a child, but filled with unease that went deeper than make-believe. She marked the submission number and checked the attached student form. The author was listed as Eva Nguyen, age 13 student at Fairwood Middle School, the same school where Elena Hart had taught. Sandra felt the hair rise on the back of her neck. She made a call to the principal of Fairwood requesting a quiet meeting. No announcement, no warning. She simply needed to talk. The principal agreed and offered to meet in the afternoon after classes had ended. Sandra printed a copy of the essay and drove across town in her dusty sedan with her heart beating faster than she liked to admit. Principal Martin greeted her with a practiced smile and led her into his office. Sandra explained what she had found and handed over the essay. As he read, the smile faded. He set the pages down slowly and rubbed his temple. He had been a young teacher when Elena Hart disappeared, new to the district and unsure of how to help at the time. He remembered the police visits, the long assemblies, the scared students. He remembered Liam Brooks and the suspicion that hovered over him like a cloud, but this essay added something new, something never investigated. He asked the school counselor to retrieve Eva Nguyen's records and schedule a meeting with her for the next morning. Sandra stayed long enough to verify the seriousness of her concern before returning home. Principal Martin sat alone for a long time after she left. He reread the final paragraph again. The teacher never screamed. The walls were too thick. The next morning, Eva sat across from the principal and the school counselor, a quiet girl with dark eyes and long sleeves that covered her wrists even in spring. She did not appear nervous. She answered politely when asked about her story. Yes, she had written it herself. Yes, she had heard it from her brother. No, she didn't think it was real, just something he used to say to scare her. She shrugged when asked more details, saying she barely remembered the whole thing, but her hands trembled when she reached for her backpack. The counselor noticed. The principal did too. They asked for her brother's name. She hesitated, then gave it. Noah Nguyen, a former student at Fairwood, now a senior at the nearby high school. They thanked her and sent her back to class. Afterward, Principal Martin called the superintendent and then the police. Detective Lisa Holloway arrived later that afternoon. She had been in high school herself when Elena Hart vanished. She remembered the face on the flyers, the candlelight vigils. This was her district now. Her case. She met with the principal and the counselor. She read the essay. She asked for access to the building's blueprints. The boiler room was listed on the original layout from 1982, but had been sealed during renovations in the early 2000s. No access doors remained visible. The district records showed it was converted into storage but had never been reassigned. That night, Detective Holloway returned with 2 officers and a forensic team. They entered through the basement utility door and began scanning the foundation walls. One section sounded hollow when tapped. The paint was newer, the bricks uneven. The wall was broken carefully brick by brick. Behind it was darkness and the thick smell of mildew. A flashlight beam revealed a narrow space less than 5 feet wide lined with old piping and rusted shelving. In the far corner lay a bundle covered in cloth. It was a coat, a scarf, a skeletal form curled in on itself like a question left unanswered. Time had reduced the body to fragments, but the identity was unmistakable. A lanyard with a broken badge lay nearby. Elena Hart. Her name still faintly visible. The building was sealed off immediately. Parents were notified, staff sent home. The media caught wind within hours. Headlines returned. Teacher found after 18 years. Investigation reopened. Rachel Hart got the call at dawn. Rachel stood at the same train platform she had used almost 2 decades earlier. The morning sun was sharp against her eyes as she waited in silence. Her hands gripped the railing tighter than necessary. She boarded without speaking. The ride was slow-winding through hills she had not seen in years. At the station, Detective Holloway met her with calm professionalism. Rachel said very little during the drive. When she arrived at the school, she stood outside for a long moment, staring at the building that had once been Elena's second home. Inside, she was led to the excavation site. The body had been removed, but the space remained open. Rachel stepped closer, the cold air of the room touching her skin. She whispered her sister's name once, and then knelt, pressing her palm against the floor. She did not cry. Not yet. The grief was too deep for tears. The news spread rapidly. The town held a candlelight vigil. Flowers were laid near the school entrance. Rachel stayed in town, reclaiming the family home on Maple Hollow Road. She visited her father's grave and placed a picture of Elena beside it. But her thoughts kept returning to the essay, the girl who had unknowingly unlocked the past. Rachel requested to meet her. Arrangements were made. Eva Nguyen arrived with her mother, quiet and respectful. Rachel knelt to the girl's level and thanked her. She asked if Eva remembered more. Eva said little, but her eyes flicked to the side when her brother's name came up. Rachel noticed. That night, she called Detective Holloway and asked her to look deeper into Noah Nguyen. The investigation was far from over. Detective Holloway reviewed the interview footage from Eva's session again, this time with a sharper eye. The way the girl avoided direct eye contact when speaking about her brother stood out. Her voice was steady, but her hands had trembled when she described the so-called prank. Holloway scribbled a note to herself and pulled up school archives to find Noah Nguyen's enrollment records. He had been 12 when Elena disappeared, the same age as Eva now. A quiet student average grades no disciplinary record, but his name appeared in 2 teacher reports from that year. One noted a tendency to wander the halls without permission. Another mentioned him being found once near the basement maintenance area, an area that should have been off limits. Holloway made a list of names of the students who had attended Fairwood Middle in 2005 and were in Noah's class. She marked 5. It was time to revisit the past through the lens of those who lived it. The first name on the list was Isaac Dunley, now 29, and working at a hardware store in the next town over. Holloway called ahead and asked if he would be willing to speak about an old classmate and a teacher who vanished. He agreed, but seemed nervous. They met in a small back room of the store surrounded by buckets of paint and metal shelving. Isaac admitted to remembering Elena. He said she was the only teacher who ever asked about his home life. He also remembered the day she disappeared. He had seen Noah and 2 other kids heading toward the boiler room entrance during lunch. He never said anything because he had been skipping class at the time and feared getting in trouble. Holloway asked for names. He hesitated, then gave them: Mark Shelby and Devin Ruelas. Both still lived locally. One worked at a body shop. The other had done time for drug possession. Holloway thanked him and moved on. Rachel spent that same afternoon at the school, sitting quietly in her sister's old classroom, which had since been converted into a supply closet. She opened the empty cabinets and found herself tracing the corners of the room, as if the walls might whisper something back to her. A janitor named Bill passed by and asked if she needed anything. Rachel said no, but thanked him anyway. Bill paused, his gaze lingering. He said he had known Elena, said he had helped fix a broken radiator in that very room a week before she vanished. Then he said something odd. He remembered a commotion downstairs that same week, a loud noise near the old boiler room. He had checked it out and found the door open, thought maybe kids were sneaking in. He sealed it again and reported it to the front office. No one followed up. Rachel asked if he remembered who was nearby. Bill frowned, trying to recall. Just the usual staff, maybe Principal Denton. That name echoed like a dropped stone. Detective Holloway pulled up the employment records. Calvin Denton had been principal of Fairwood until 2013 when he quietly retired. No scandals, no complaints. Yet Rachel had mentioned that Elena once considered transferring schools because of tension with her administration. Holloway tracked him to a lakeside property 2 towns away. She called ahead and arranged a meeting. Denton welcomed her with forced warmth. He was in his late 60s, gray thinning hair and a cane to steady his walk. When asked about Elena, he grew guarded. Said she was a fine teacher. Said her disappearance had been a tragedy. But when Holloway pressed about the boiler room or any reports of students sneaking in, his tone shifted. He said he did not recall any specific incidents, claimed it had been too long. Holloway noted his discomfort. Before leaving, she asked him if he remembered a student named Noah Nguyen. Denton paused just long enough to make her suspicious. Then he said the name rang a bell. That evening, Rachel sat across from Ava at a diner near the town center. They had agreed to meet with the principal's help. Ava sipped a chocolate milkshake and avoided eye contact. Rachel gently asked if she could tell her more about what Noah used to say. Eva fidgeted. Then she said he had once drawn a map of the school on a napkin and marked the old boiler room with a red X. He called it the secret room. He told her never to go near it. He said it was where they left the teacher who would not stop asking questions. Rachel's voice remained calm, but her heart raced. She asked if Eva still had the drawing. Eva nodded. She said she kept it in a box of old things under her bed. Rachel asked if she could have it. Eva agreed. That night, Rachel scanned the paper. The lines were childish but clear. The boiler room had been marked with a single phrase. Don't dig too deep. Detective Holloway knocked on Noah's door the next day. He answered with tired eyes and headphones hanging around his neck. His mother stood behind him, visibly concerned. Holloway asked to speak with him privately. He agreed. They sat on the porch while the wind rustled the trees overhead. Holloway asked about his time at Fairwood. He shrugged, said it was normal. She asked about Elena Hart. He said she was nice. She asked about the boiler room. His fingers twitched. He said he didn't know anything about it. She told him about the essay, about Ava's memory, about the drawing. His face went pale. He stood abruptly and said he needed to go inside. Holloway let him. She filed a report of the interaction. There was no confession, no evidence, but there was enough now to request access to the old counselor records from 2005. In those records, Holloway found a series of appointments involving 5 students, the same 5 names she had flagged. They had been referred for behavior issues shortly after Elena's disappearance. The notes were brief, vague. One entry stood out. A student claimed he saw someone being locked in the basement. It had been dismissed as fantasy. The counselor no longer worked there. The trail was thinning. Holloway knew time was running out to catch the truth before it faded again. Rachel stood by the window of the guest room in her family home, staring out at the maple trees swaying in the morning breeze. She had spent another sleepless night reviewing the napkin drawing Ava had given her. The red X haunted her. The childish script haunted her even more. Don't dig too deep. She had spoken to Detective Holloway the evening before, sharing the drawing and her suspicions. Holloway had agreed it pointed toward something long hidden, possibly orchestrated by people in authority. Now, Rachel waited for a call, unable to shake the cold certainty that her sister had been silenced, not by chance, but by design. The phone finally rang just past 9. Holloway's voice was tense. She had spoken with one of the former students mentioned in the counselor records, Devin Ruelas. He had agreed to meet, but under one condition. He did not want it happening at the police station. He had insisted on somewhere public but quiet. Rachel asked if she could come. Holloway paused, then agreed. They arranged to meet in a small community park near the outskirts of town. The park was mostly empty when they arrived. Wooden benches faced a pond surrounded by reeds. Ducks floated lazily along the edge. Devin sat near the farthest bench wearing a faded hoodie and frayed jeans. His face was thinner than Rachel expected, his eyes sunken but alert. He looked like a man who had lived with something he could not forget. Holloway introduced herself. Rachel remained silent, watching him closely. Devin said he remembered everything. He said he had kept it quiet all these years because he was afraid. Not of getting in trouble, but of the people involved. He said that day had begun like any other, with lunch in the cafeteria and rumors about Miss Hart confronting someone in administration. He said Noah and 2 other boys had invited him to join them in a prank they were planning. They wanted to scare Elena. They said she needed to be taught a lesson. He thought it was a joke. Devin shifted uncomfortably on the bench. He said he followed them to the basement hallway behind the cafeteria. One of the boys had a key. He did not know where it came from, but it opened the service door. They went in laughing. Elena followed about 5 minutes later. She had apparently been tipped off that students were sneaking into restricted areas. Devin said she called out once and then stepped into the dark corridor. The boys closed the door behind her and slid the bolt. They were still laughing. Devin said they did not mean to hurt her, they just wanted her to be scared for a few minutes. But then things changed. One of the boys, he thought it was Mark, said they could leave her longer. Said no one would hear her in there. Devin grew nervous. He left. The next day, Elena was missing. When he asked about her, Noah told him to shut up, said they would all go down if anyone spoke. Devin said he tried to forget but never could. Holloway asked who had the key. Devin hesitated again, then said it was given to Mark by someone in the office. He did not know who, but Mark had said it came from someone who wanted Elena gone. Someone who said she was making problems, that she was asking too many questions. Rachel's hands trembled in her lap. She asked Devin why he never spoke up. He looked at her with a face full of shame and said he was 13 and terrified. He said nobody would have believed him. Holloway asked for the names of the others. Devin repeated them. Mark Shelby, Noah Nguyen, Isaac Dunley, another boy, Luis Harrow, had moved away shortly after. Devin did not know where he went. Rachel asked what Elena had been asking questions about. Devin only shook his head. He said he did not know, just that Mark kept saying she needed to mind her own business. Back at the police station, Holloway filed a new report. The timeline was aligning. Multiple students involved. One admitting partial guilt. A key unaccounted for. A principal who had since retired without explanation. Rachel stayed in the waiting room, staring at the worn carpet. Her mind returned to a memory from years ago. Elena had called her one night sounding frustrated. She said she had found something odd in a stack of files. Something about funding. She never explained further. Rachel had dismissed it at the time. She assumed it was school politics. Now she wondered if that was what led to her death. Holloway returned and said they needed to talk to Mark Shelby. He had been working at a body shop outside town. She would bring him in for questioning. Rachel asked if she could sit in. Holloway said no, not yet, but she promised to update her. Mark Shelby arrived late that afternoon wearing a stained work shirt and a tired expression. He looked older than his years. Holloway asked him about his time at Fairwood. He claimed not to remember much. When asked directly about Elena Hart, he flinched. Holloway pressed harder. She mentioned the key, the prank, Devon's confession. Mark leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw. Then he said something strange. He said it was not his idea. He said it had come from the top. Someone who had told them that Elena was going to cause trouble for everyone. That she had discovered something. That it would ruin lives. He said he never meant for her to die. Said the plan was just to scare her. But when the door jammed, they panicked. They thought she would be found. Then, when no one did, it was too late. Holloway asked who gave him the key. Mark looked down. He said the name quietly. Calvin Denton. Detective Holloway closed the interview room door and sat down in her office with a slow breath. Mark Shelby's statement had changed everything. Until now, she had suspected negligence or even bullying gone wrong. But with the former principal's name placed at the center of the plot, the case now tilted into something deeper and darker. She reached for the oldest case file still stored in the precinct's cabinet, the one labeled Elena Hart Missing Persons, 2005. Inside were the original notes from that year, including interview transcripts, photos of the abandoned Subaru by the frozen lake, and a few pages of staff logs. At the bottom of the file, loosely stapled and half-faded, were notes from the former school counselor, a woman named Teresa Raddick. The entries were short and lacked specifics, but one of them caught Holloway's attention. It was dated 2 weeks before Elena disappeared and referenced a teacher expressing concern over falsified records. The note did not name the teacher, but the timing lined up. Holloway grabbed her keys and headed to the school. She needed to find out if any of those records still existed. The administrative offices at Fairwood Middle had been updated since 2005. New paint, new desks, new people, but the storage room in the back remained mostly untouched. Holloway walked past boxes labeled yearbooks and PTA minutes and found a metal filing cabinet with brittle stickers and a rusted lock. The custodian unlocked it for her. Inside were stacks of attendance reports, budget sheets, and district correspondence. She dug through layers until she found a folder marked 2004 to 2005 Teacher Concerns. It contained only 3 memos. The second was from Elena Hart. Her handwriting was neat and deliberate. The memo described her suspicion that a set of district reimbursements had been signed off under false pretenses. She believed funds meant for student services were being redirected. She had requested an internal audit. The memo was dated February 2nd, 2005. She vanished February 17th. Holloway's stomach tightened. She made copies and left the originals in place. Back at her office, she added the evidence to the growing case against Calvin Denton. Rachel was at the town library when Holloway called. She had been combing through local newspaper archives, looking for anything her sister might have seen or read that raised alarms. When Holloway told her about the memo, Rachel said she remembered a night call from Elena in early February. Elena had mentioned being stonewalled by someone in the office. Rachel had encouraged her to stay out of it, not realizing the danger. She hung up and sat there for a long moment staring at a grainy newspaper clipping about a school district audit that had been quietly canceled in 2005. No follow-up article was ever published. Rachel took a photo of the page and forwarded it to Holloway. She then packed her bag and walked out into the cold afternoon air filled with guilt and dread. Her sister had not simply disappeared. She had been silenced. And now it was time to find the voice that had ordered that silence. Detective Holloway drove back to Denton's lakeside house this time with a warrant in hand. The sun was just starting to dip below the trees when he opened the door. His face was expressionless, as if he had been expecting her. She informed him of the warrant and stepped inside. The house was tidy but lifeless. She asked him to sit in the living room while her team searched the office. Denton remained still, hands folded. Holloway asked him again about Elena. This time she read the memo aloud. His lips pressed into a thin line. When she mentioned the students and the key, his face twitched. Then he spoke quietly. He said he had made a mistake. He said Elena was relentless, that she would not let things go, that she had threatened to go public. He said he never told the students to hurt her. He had just wanted her out of the way long enough for the situation to calm. When asked if he gave Mark Shelby the key, he paused. Then he nodded. In Denton's office, officers found a locked drawer. Inside were old floppy disks, an analog recorder, and several printed financial spreadsheets. One of them showed altered figures for a school lunch reimbursement program signed off with Denton's initials. Another showed diverted funds to a maintenance budget that never appeared on district reports. Holloway bagged the documents and had the disks transferred for digital recovery. When she returned to the living room, Denton had not moved. She read him his rights and placed him under arrest for obstruction of justice conspiracy and involvement in the unlawful confinement and resulting death of Elena Hart. He said nothing. As the cruiser pulled away from the driveway, Holloway glanced at the tree-lined road and wondered how long the truth had been sitting in this house waiting to be discovered. Rachel stood in the hallway of Fairwood Middle School that evening, staring at the memorial display that had gone up in Elena's honor. Photos of her sister smiling with students. A framed letter of appreciation. A single candle flickering in a glass case. Rachel reached out and touched the edge of the frame. A student passed by and paused. She looked up and said her older brother had told her Elena was his favorite teacher. Rachel smiled weakly and thanked her. As the girl walked away, Rachel whispered a promise to the photo. She said she would not stop until everyone who played a part was held accountable. Later that night, Holloway sat at her desk listening to the recovered audio from the recorder found in Denton's office. Most of it was mundane. Staff meetings, memos, personal notes. But one section stood out. It captured a conversation between Denton and another voice, possibly a district administrator. The voices discussed a teacher raising alarms and how it could cost them grants. Denton mentioned that a solution had been arranged, that certain students could be convinced to help. The tone was casual, businesslike. Holloway clenched her jaw and flagged the file as evidence. The weight of the case pressed down harder than ever. There was more to uncover, more names to confront. The following morning, Rachel stood outside the district's administrative building, holding a folder that contained copies of everything Holloway had uncovered. The winter air was sharp and dry against her cheeks. She had requested a meeting with the current superintendent, a woman named Carla Whitaker, who had taken over long after Denton's quiet retirement. Rachel had no intention of accusing her, but she needed answers. She needed to know how so many people had allowed her sister to vanish without questioning the loose threads. The receptionist led her into a sleek office with high ceilings and polished tile floors. Superintendent Whitaker greeted her warmly, but with evident caution. Rachel placed the folder on the table and calmly began to explain. She spoke of Denton, the key, the confession, and the audio file. Whitaker listened in silence, her fingers laced tightly. When Rachel finished, Whitaker exhaled slowly and said there were things she had heard over the years but never confirmed. Denton had been respected but guarded. He had left abruptly. She had always assumed it was related to health issues. She now realized she had inherited more than just an office. She had inherited buried truth. Meanwhile, Holloway returned to the station and met with Officer Leon Rivera, a young but methodical tech analyst who had been working on the data from Denton's floppy disks. Rivera reported that most of the files were corrupted or irrelevant, but one folder contained scanned receipts and documents linked to a company named Farwell Maintenance. It appeared that Denton had funneled funds into fake service contracts with this vendor. The address listed for the company belonged to a small post office box in New Hampshire. The tax ID traced back to a man named Edward Farwell, who once served as a facilities consultant for the district. Holloway requested all available records and discovered that Farwell had been contracted during the years Elena worked at the school. She recognized the name from a side note in Elena's memo, where she had questioned duplicate billing for janitorial services. Holloway added Farwell to the list of persons of interest and issued a formal request to locate him. Rachel left the meeting with Superintendent Whitaker with more questions than answers. She walked through the town square, pausing near the statue of the town founder, a stone figure that had watched over the valley for over a century. It struck her how unchanged the town looked. The same sidewalks, the same school bell echoing through the wind. It made the years feel collapsed, like everything from 2005 had only just happened. She sat on a bench and stared at the courthouse across the street, wondering how long justice had been waiting there. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Holloway. She had spoken with Luis Harrow, the 5th student from the counselor records. He had agreed to meet. Rachel texted back and asked if she could come too. Holloway replied with a time and place. Rachel stood up, brushed snow off her coat, and headed back toward her car. The diner where they met Luis was nearly empty except for a couple of retired men playing chess in the corner. Luis was heavier now, with thinning hair and a nervous energy. He recognized Rachel immediately and looked down at the table. Holloway introduced herself and kept her tone neutral. Luis said he had moved away shortly after the incident, his family relocating to Illinois. He never told his parents what happened. He had carried the guilt for 18 years. He said it started as a dare. Mark and Noah said Elena was going to ruin everything. They said she needed to be scared off. He never expected they would actually lock her in. He said he heard her voice through the vents once. She had called for help, but they told him it was too late, that she would be found eventually. But no one found her, and when days passed, the truth became a trap he could not escape. Rachel asked why he never spoke up. He said he tried once, but a teacher overheard and told him to stop spreading rumors. After that, he stayed quiet. Holloway asked if he remembered any other names, anyone else who might have known. Luis hesitated, then said there was a girl, a friend of his who had been nearby that day. Her name was Melanie York. She had seen them go into the boiler hallway. She had seen Elena follow. He did not know why she never said anything. Maybe she thought it was none of her business. Rachel wrote down the name and promised to find her. Luis asked if this would mean charges. Holloway said the investigation was still ongoing. She could not promise anything. He nodded and said he understood. Before leaving, he looked at Rachel and said he was sorry. She said nothing, only nodded and turned away. The apology was late, but it was the first time anyone had admitted the full weight of what they had done. Back at the precinct, Holloway pulled up Melanie York's records. She now lived 3 towns over and worked at a local clinic as a receptionist. Holloway called the clinic and requested a meeting under the pretext of a background check. Melanie agreed. The next morning, Holloway and Rachel made the drive through the winding hills, the sun glinting off melting snow. The clinic was quiet, filled with soft beeping monitors and the smell of antiseptic. Melanie was waiting near the lobby, her badge clipped to a blue cardigan. Her eyes widened slightly when she saw Rachel, but she stayed composed. They sat in a small office behind the check-in counter. Holloway explained the investigation. Melanie listened, her fingers curled tightly around a pen. When asked about the day Elena disappeared, her lips parted but no words came out. Rachel spoke gently, reminding her of how much Elena had cared for her students, that she had fought for them even when it meant putting herself at risk. Melanie's voice cracked. She said she had seen the boys lead Elena down the hallway. She had followed out of curiosity but stopped when she heard the door slam. She waited for Elena to come back out. She never did. She wanted to tell someone but was afraid. Her older brother had warned her to stay out of it. He said it would ruin their family if she got involved. So she stayed silent. And when the investigation died down, she convinced herself it had all been a misunderstanding. She said she had never stopped feeling guilty. Holloway asked if she would be willing to make a formal statement. Melanie nodded slowly. Her eyes welled with tears as she whispered that it was time. Detective Holloway returned to the station with a renewed sense of momentum. The interviews with Luis and Melanie had added depth to the case and painted a clearer picture of the pressure and fear that kept so many silent. She updated the official file and flagged both statements for review by the district attorney. The narrative was shifting from negligence to coordinated suppression. Holloway believed there were still missing pieces. Denton had not acted alone. Someone else had helped him clean up the loose ends, someone who knew the building, the systems, the timing. She opened a new line of inquiry focused on former maintenance staff. There was one name that appeared repeatedly in work orders and budget sheets from 2005. Edward Farwell. He had been listed as a subcontractor but was never directly employed by the school. She had already traced his business to a closed P.O. box. Now she needed to find him in person. Rachel spent the evening in her sister's old bedroom, flipping through photo albums and notebooks. The walls were still painted the pale lavender Elena had chosen in high school. Rachel sat cross-legged on the bed and opened a small box from the closet that contained old school mementos. Inside were yearbooks, ticket stubs, and postcards. One postcard stood out. It was unsigned, addressed to Elena, and postmarked only 2 weeks before her disappearance. The message was vague but unsettling. It mentioned a project that could collapse if she did not back off. Rachel turned the card over again and again. The handwriting was blocky and impersonal. She wondered if Elena had kept other notes. Her mind went to the crawlspace beneath the back porch, a space where they used to hide things as children. She grabbed a flashlight and a sweater and stepped outside. The crawlspace door groaned as Rachel pulled it open. Dust and spider webs coated the edges. She crouched and crawled through, moving slowly, with her flashlight sweeping the corners. At the far end, near the foundation wall, she saw a plastic tub covered in a garbage bag. She pulled it toward her and opened the lid. Inside was a folder wrapped in wax paper. The folder contained handwritten notes, copied documents, and a cassette tape. Rachel sat back and shined her flashlight on the top page. It was a rough outline of a presentation. The title read, "Financial Discrepancies and Unauthorized Contracts." Elena had been planning to speak at a board meeting. The documents included photocopies of checks made out to Farwell Maintenance, flagged inconsistencies in repair costs, and copies of emails printed from a school computer. Rachel carefully slid the contents back into the tub and carried it inside. The next morning, she called Holloway and asked her to come over. When the detective arrived, Rachel spread everything on the dining room table. Holloway recognized the format. Elena had compiled a whistleblower packet. She had been preparing to go public likely the week she vanished. Holloway picked up the cassette tape and read the label. March 4th, 2005. It was 2 weeks after Elena's disappearance. Rachel fetched an old player from the attic and inserted the tape. The sound was muffled at first, then the voice of Edward Farwell came through. He spoke in low, urgent tones, describing budget diversions, kickbacks, and threats. He mentioned Denton by name. He also expressed fear that someone had been watching him. The tape ended abruptly. Rachel and Holloway sat in silence, the weight of Elena's bravery pressing between them. Holloway ran the tape through official channels and filed the additional documents as evidence. She then contacted the DA's office and scheduled a meeting to present the findings. That same afternoon, her department located a current address for Edward Farwell in a rural area of northern Vermont. Holloway and 2 officers made the drive, arriving at a modest house set back from the road. Farwell answered the door cautiously. He was older, slower, but his eyes were sharp. Holloway introduced herself and stated the nature of her visit. Farwell did not resist. He invited them in and sat heavily at the kitchen table. He said he knew this day might come. He admitted to working with Denton on fraudulent maintenance contracts. He said they had both benefited from it, but that he grew uneasy when Elena started asking questions. He claimed he warned Denton to stop before things went too far. Denton dismissed him and said it would be handled. Farwell said he mailed Elena an anonymous warning postcard. He did not know what Denton planned until she disappeared. After that, he shut down the P.O. box and left the business. He kept quiet out of fear. He agreed to make a full statement and turned over an old file cabinet that contained more records of their dealings. Holloway called the station to request transport and returned with Farwell to the precinct. While Holloway prepared her full report, Rachel met with Eva Nguyen again. They sat in the school library, now named the Hart Memorial Library. Eva asked if they had found out who really did it. Rachel explained as gently as she could that it had not been one person. It had been a system of silence. Eva looked down at her notebook and said she never meant to uncover something that big. She just wanted to write a story. Rachel smiled and said sometimes stories are the only way the truth survives. Eva gave her a folded paper and said it was her new essay. Rachel opened it later at home. It was titled, "The Teacher Who Would Not Give Up." The first sentence read, "She told us history matters because it holds us accountable." Rachel wept as she read the rest. The district attorney's office called a formal meeting to review the new evidence gathered over the past 3 weeks. Detective Holloway arrived early with a stack of labeled files and a flash drive containing digitized copies of the audio tapes, memos, scanned invoices, and student statements. Rachel sat beside her at the long mahogany table, fingers clasped tightly on her lap. A senior prosecutor named Dean Langston led the meeting, joined by 2 assistant DAs and a paralegal who recorded the session. Langston reviewed the chain of evidence with careful attention. He asked precise questions, pausing after each to note Rachel's expressions. He said the confession from Farwell, the memo from Elena, the tape from the crawlspace, and the student testimonies painted a pattern not just of corruption, but obstruction and criminal negligence. He warned that a case this old would face pushback. Witness memory could be challenged. Documentation could be questioned. Still, he acknowledged the clarity and strength of what they had. Langston said he would proceed with filing charges against Calvin Denton and Edward Farwell, and would begin preparations to determine whether any current district employees had failed to act during the original investigation. After the meeting, Holloway and Rachel stepped into the hallway, the late afternoon light casting sharp lines across the courthouse floor. Rachel leaned against the wall and asked how many people would face consequences. Holloway said that depended on who stepped forward next. She had a list of remaining staff from 2005 who still worked in the school system. She planned to re-interview them with a new approach. One name stood out: Teresa Raddick, the former school counselor who had taken notes on the boys but never followed up. Teresa had retired 5 years earlier but still lived locally. Holloway decided to contact her. Rachel offered to come along. Holloway agreed. They made the visit the following morning. Teresa answered the door of her tidy townhouse wearing a soft cardigan and house slippers. Her silver hair was pinned up and she looked surprised but not alarmed. She invited them inside. Holloway explained the case and asked about her notes from 2005. Teresa sat very still. She said she remembered Elena well. She called her passionate, kind, and deeply devoted to her students. Teresa admitted she'd been warned by Denton to stay quiet when the boys began acting strangely. He told her it was unrelated. She had trusted him. She had felt uncomfortable about it, especially after Elena disappeared. But she had convinced herself it was just a coincidence. Holloway asked why she had not said anything when the case went cold. Teresa looked away and said she was afraid of losing her job. She had worked for the district for 30 years. She said she carried the guilt with her every day. Rachel said that guilt would mean nothing if the truth stayed buried. Teresa nodded. She said she would cooperate and signed a formal statement that afternoon. That evening, Holloway received a message from the forensic lab confirming that a match had been made between Elena's handwriting and the unsigned memo found in the district files. This closed another question the legal team had raised. Elena had officially documented her concerns. The paper trail now connected directly to the misused funds and identified key players. Holloway drove back to the station, placed the confirmation in the master file, and stared at the timeline pinned across her whiteboard. She had marked every day from February 1st to March 4th, 2005. One date was circled in red, February 22nd. That had been the school board meeting Elena was scheduled to attend. She never made it. Holloway remembered the audio tape. She replayed the segment where Farwell mentioned the meeting and said Denton had done something to prevent her from speaking. It had never made sense. Now, she believed Denton had coordinated her disappearance to coincide with that very meeting. Rachel sat at her kitchen table that night reading over a transcript of Elena's presentation outline. It was logical, clear, and damning. Her sister had listed names, budget line items, and mismatched signatures. She had planned to speak with calm authority to warn the district of what was happening. She never made it. Rachel imagined Elena arriving that day confident and prepared. Then she pictured her being lured down that hallway believing she was stopping a group of students from causing trouble. The trap had worked because Elena trusted her students. That trust had been exploited. Rachel folded the pages and placed them back into the folder. She stared at the wall and said aloud that her sister had not died in vain. Not anymore. 2 days later, Holloway visited the home of Douglas Weaver, a retired district accountant who had processed payroll and invoices during Denton's tenure. He lived alone in a house filled with paper stacks and filing cabinets. Holloway asked about the Farwell maintenance contracts. Weaver hesitated, then pulled out a manila envelope from a locked drawer. Inside were duplicate copies of payment authorizations. One had his signature. The other had a forged version of it. He said he had noticed discrepancies but was told by Denton's office that his concerns had been resolved internally. He said he kept the documents in case something ever came back. Holloway scanned the pages and thanked him. She had them entered into the evidence log that same evening. Rachel began receiving letters. Former students and teachers reached out after hearing the case had been reopened. Some shared memories of Elena's classroom. Others offered statements or wrote about their own regrets. One letter came from a woman who had been a junior at the time. She remembered Elena staying late every day to help her pass history. She had never forgotten her. She wrote that she had been afraid to speak because her father worked for the district and she thought it would cost him his job. She ended the letter by saying thank you for not giving up. Rachel read each letter slowly, tears building behind her eyes. She pinned the notes to a board above her desk and whispered her sister's name each time. Detective Holloway stepped into the courtroom gallery on the day of the pre-trial hearing, her file box tucked under one arm and her badge clipped plainly to her belt. The space was mostly quiet except for the soft shuffling of feet and the low murmur of voices. Calvin Denton sat at the defense table with his attorney, his face pale but composed. Edward Farwell was seated a row behind him, eyes fixed on the floor. Rachel sat in the front row of the public section, hands folded over a yellow legal pad. She did not take notes. She only listened. The judge entered and began reviewing the charges, reading them clearly and slowly for the record. Obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, conspiracy to commit fraud, unlawful confinement. Holloway watched Denton's shoulders stiffen with each count. She studied his expression and saw no remorse, only calculation. Farwell, on the other hand, seemed to shrink deeper into his chair with every word. The hearing lasted less than an hour. Both men were denied bail based on the nature and extent of the charges. As they were led away, Rachel remained seated, her eyes steady. She had waited 18 years for this moment. She had not come for revenge. She had come for truth. After the hearing, Holloway met with District Attorney Langston in his office. The walls were lined with framed degrees and old case photos, but Langston's desk was neat and uncluttered. He reviewed the next steps and said the official trial date would be announced in 2 weeks. He planned to call more than a dozen witnesses, including Rachel former students Teresa Raddick and Douglas Weaver. He would also submit the audio tapes, the memo, and the newly discovered payment records. He wanted to establish not only the criminal actions, but the culture of silence that had allowed them to happen. Holloway agreed. She suggested they also call Superintendent Whitaker to testify that the district had failed to act when early signs emerged. Langston nodded and said the impact on the school system would be significant. He warned that public reaction would grow sharper once the trial began. Holloway told him the public had a right to know. She said silence was part of what killed Elena. Langston said then it was time for the town to listen. Rachel spent the next several days preparing her testimony. She read over Elena's memo again and again, memorizing every line and underlining passages she wanted to quote. She practiced speaking aloud, trying to steady her voice and push through the weight of emotion that always rose when she spoke her sister's name. At night, she sat by the fireplace, rereading the letters she had received from former students. Each one reminded her that Elena had not been forgotten, that her kindness had outlived her silence, that her death had left a wound deeper than anyone admitted at the time. One letter in particular stayed with her. It came from a janitor who had worked at the school for only a year. He said he remembered hearing noises near the boiler room the week Elena vanished. He thought it was rats. He asked for forgiveness. Rachel pinned the letter to her board and whispered that he was forgiven. What mattered now was that people were finally speaking. Detective Holloway returned to Fairwood Middle School one last time before the trial began. The library had officially reopened as the Hart Memorial Library, and a bronze plaque now hung near the entrance bearing Elena's name and the words, "She gave voice to the quiet." Holloway stood in the corner and watched a small group of students reading at the tables. Eva Nguyen sat near the window writing in her notebook. The librarian waved to Holloway and offered her a seat. Holloway declined, but thanked her. She made her way through the hallways, noting how the building still smelled faintly of chalk and cleaning solution. She paused outside the maintenance door that once led to the sealed boiler room. It had been repurposed into a storage closet, and a new lock had been installed. She ran her fingers along the frame and then walked away. She had done her job. She had found the truth. Now the law would decide what to do with it. As word spread that the trial was moving forward, more community members came forward. Some were parents who remembered Elena's smile during school plays or PTA meetings. Others were former staff who had heard rumors and chose to ignore them. A retired secretary submitted a sworn affidavit stating that Denton had removed several documents from Elena's personnel file the week after she vanished. A substitute teacher recalled being asked to erase mentions of Elena from the lesson plans. Each account added another thread to the tapestry of what had been hidden. The district issued a public apology signed by Superintendent Whitaker, acknowledging the failures of oversight and the long silence that followed. It was not enough to satisfy everyone, but it marked a shift. The town was no longer pretending this had never happened. Rachel received a call from Melanie York 3 days before the trial. Melanie said she had been meeting with a counselor to help process everything. She asked if Rachel would sit with her in court. Rachel said yes. She said the strength Melanie showed now was what mattered. Melanie said she wished she had said something sooner. Rachel told her that saying something now still mattered. They agreed to meet at the courthouse on the first morning of testimony. Rachel hung up and stared at the family photo on the living room wall. Elena was smiling in the center, wearing a blue sweater and holding a mug of tea. Rachel reached up and touched the glass. She said she hoped Elena would be proud. She said they were almost there. On the eve of the trial, Holloway sat at her desk reviewing her notes one final time. She felt the fatigue in her bones, but refused to let it cloud her focus. She thought of the day she first read Eva Nguyen's essay. The words had seemed like fiction then. Now they were the key that opened everything. She thought of the way Denton had looked when arrested, of the silence in Farwell's kitchen, of the pain in Rachel's voice and the fire in her eyes. She thought of Elena's final days and the courage it must have taken to walk into that board meeting with evidence in hand, unaware that she would never make it. Holloway closed her folder and stood. Tomorrow, the town would hear the full story. No whispers, no cover-ups, only truth. The courtroom filled quickly on the morning of the trial's opening day. Reporters set up outside the courthouse before sunrise, their camera crews tracking every movement of attorneys, witnesses, and public officials as they entered the building. The community, once quiet and hesitant, now gathered with a sense of somber unity. Teachers, former students, and parents lined the gallery benches, their faces serious and patient. Rachel arrived with Melanie York and sat near the front beside Detective Holloway, who held a slim binder of prepared testimony. The prosecutor, Dean Langston, stood at the podium and gave his opening statement with quiet gravity. He spoke not of a sensational case, but of the slow erosion of truth. He told the court how a teacher's voice had been smothered by fear, and how that silence had infected an entire system. He said the time had come to put every piece of that silence on record. The first witness was Douglas Weaver, the retired district accountant. He confirmed the presence of forged documents in the school's financial records. He stated plainly that he had raised concerns to Denton but was told to stop asking questions. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled as he gestured to the copies of checks and invoices submitted into evidence. The defense attorney asked if he had proof that anyone else in the district office knew about the fraud. Weaver said no, but that Denton had signed every authorization. His testimony ended with a short apology to Rachel as he stepped down. She nodded, but said nothing. Next came Teresa Raddick, the former school counselor. She entered the room, slowly using a cane, and took the stand with visible tension. She confirmed that several students had shown behavioral changes in the weeks before Elena's disappearance. She acknowledged her failure to act when one student claimed to have witnessed something disturbing. She said Denton had warned her to stay quiet. The defense questioned her memory and credibility, but she held firm. She looked at Rachel once during her testimony and said that not a day passed when she did not regret her silence. Louise Harrow and Isaac Dunley testified next. Their stories overlapped in all the expected ways. They confirmed that a group of boys had been involved in a prank that went too far. They admitted they were told to keep quiet. They named Denton directly. They described how they had grown up carrying that secret, how it had shaped their lives in ways they barely understood. When asked why they waited so long, Louise said he had always hoped someone else would speak first. Isaac said he was ashamed. Neither man cried, but both looked visibly lighter when they left the stand. The most emotional moment came when Melanie York was called. She sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap. When asked what she saw, she described the day Elena had followed the boys down the hallway. She said she saw the door close. She waited for Elena to come back. She never did. Melanie said she had been 15 and afraid. She said she told no one for years. When the prosecutor asked her what finally changed, she turned toward Rachel in the courtroom and said that someone had to stop pretending it had never happened, that it was time to say it out loud. She stepped down to a long silence. Rachel testified the next day. The courtroom fell into complete stillness as she walked to the stand. Her voice was soft but unwavering. She spoke about her sister not as a victim but as a person. She described Elena's love for her students, her dedication to fairness, and her courage in the face of difficult truths. She told the court about the memo Elena wrote, the presentation she had prepared, and the threats she received. She recounted the night she found the hidden folder in the crawl space. She said Elena had not been trying to bring anyone down. She had only wanted the truth to matter. Rachel ended her statement by saying that her sister deserved to be remembered for what she stood for, not just how she died. Many in the room wiped tears from their eyes as she returned to her seat. When Detective Holloway was called, she gave a detailed timeline of the investigation. She walked the court through every document, every tape, every statement. She connected each name and date with clinical precision. She spoke of the moment the boiler room was opened. She described the discovery of the bicycle. She did not embellish or dramatize. She simply stated what was found and how it was hidden. The prosecutor asked if the case could have been solved earlier. Holloway paused and said yes if people had been willing to listen. She looked directly at Denton as she said it. He did not return her gaze. Calvin Denton chose not to testify. His attorney argued that he had made poor decisions under stress and had not intended for anyone to be harmed. The prosecutor refuted that argument by replaying the tape where Denton's voice described Elena as a problem that would be handled. Farwell testified briefly admitting his role in the cover-up, but insisting he never knew Elena had been locked in. He said he mailed her a warning. He said he was afraid. The courtroom remained silent after he spoke. The final statement came from Dean Langston. He stood with no notes and looked directly at the jury. He said that justice was not a perfect process and that sometimes it came too late to save the person who needed it most. He said the question was not whether Denton had committed every action himself, but whether he had built the conditions where others did. He said Elena Hart had died because people with power chose fear over truth. Then he asked the jury to give her back what was stolen. He asked them to give her name a verdict that told the world she had been right to speak. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, the courtroom held its breath. The verdict was guilty on all counts for both Denton and Farwell. The judge ordered sentencing to follow within 30 days. As the courtroom emptied, Rachel sat still for a long moment. People came by to touch her shoulder or whisper their support. She nodded to each one but stayed in her seat. Holloway approached and asked if she was ready to go. Rachel said yes. They walked outside into the late afternoon sun, the air crisp and clear. For the first time in years, Rachel felt something ease in her chest. It was not closure, it was not peace, it was something quieter. It was knowing the silence was broken. A month later, the school held a memorial for Elena. It took place in the library under the bronze plaque. Former students read essays and poems. One by one, they shared stories about how she had helped them or believed in them when no one else did. Eva Nguyen stood last. She read her newest essay not about a ghost in the walls, but about a voice that was never truly gone. She said Elena Hart had taught her that stories could change the world not because they were loud, but because they were true. The room stood when she finished. Rachel stood too. She placed her hand on the plaque and whispered that Elena had been heard. If this story moved, you remember to like and subscribe to support more true-to-life storytelling. Let us know in the comments what part struck you the most and where you're watching from. Your voice matters here too.